Hi, Vinnie. Thank you so much for taking the time. You're talking to me from Denver. Can you just start by explaining your name, your pronouns, and your role?
Yeah, my name is Vinnie Cervantes, he, him, his. I am the founder and director of DASHR, Denver Alliance for Street Health Response, and we work to create and support community-based responses to conflict and crisis.
Wonderful. So, can you tell us about the Denver Alliance for Street Health Response, or DASHR, and how it meets your community's needs?
Yeah, so we were founded in 2018 off of the explicit effort to try to create a non-police alternative similar to the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon. And so we were a coalition of folks that had experience in different realms of advocacy and direct service, especially those that serve unhoused folks, groups that serve folks with substance use issues, and general advocacy around criminal justice reform. So that's the realm that I came from. And in working with folks who are victims of police violence, I really learned about this Cahoots program and felt that it was something that Denver really needed. And so that's why we came together. And, shortly after we came together, we expanded our scope of what we wanted to do, knowing that just replacing police in the moment is not the only thing that we should be doing. And there's so many other ways that we can intercept the way that criminal justice system addresses issues in our community when they don't need to be around. And so, since then, we've been working to create alternatives to policing in jail, and have been successful in Denver and also in Aurora as well.
Amazing. So everyone gets involved in advocating for non-police civilian first responder programs in different ways, or they get interested in that sort of thing. Can you tell me about the motivation for you and how it felt when you first learned about the Cahoots program?
Yeah, the motivation for me is just, on one hand, we have policies in Denver that criminalize homeless folks. And so, we make it illegal to sleep in your car, to distribute food in public, to sleep or stay in a public right of way, and to use anything other than your clothing for shelter from the elements. And in a place like Denver, that is incredibly violent and harmful to our community because our temperature changes so often and so unpredictably that it could go from 80 one day, and if you're on the street you could be feeling okay, and you'd be not worried about the weather, and then snowing later. And so working with our unhoused community is something that drove me to want to have a different alternative to how we address, social determinants of health and crisis in our community, and then also working with victims of police violence. And in particular, there was, an incident that really got me involved, or at least increased my involvement, which was the murder of Michael Marshall in 2015. And Michael Marshall was a man who was unhoused. He was Black. He had mental health issues, and he was known as a street preacher. And he was experienced a mental health crisis as a result of losing his Bible in a hotel where he was staying. And as a result of that crisis, the police were called. He was arrested for trespassing and brought to the Denver jail, where he was later killed by getting instigated into another crisis. And so that particular death, really drove a lot of our community to protest and advocate on his behalf and his family's behalf. And it was working with his family and the families of Marvin Booker and Paul Castaway, Jesse Hernandez's family, and all these victims of police violence that really made it clear for me that we need a different way to respond to crisis and to start to work to replace policing rather than create some of the reforms that we had been working on, because it just wasn't enough. And so that's what drove me to want to do this. And when I learned about Cahoots, it just made so much sense. It's been around for decades and it's been so successful. And not only has it proven a more humane way and more effective way to approach crisis and to deal with our community members, but it's also saved the city of Eugene money. And that was a real thing that we knew would appeal to our elected officials and our city leadership in Denver. So it was like, just such a perfect solution for so many different things. As you said, people come to this kind of way of advocacy from so many different spaces. And this type of program is kind of this, coalescence of so many different movements. When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement around rights for unhoused folks, the LGBTQ movement, disability rights movement, which has a huge place in Denver. There's so many things that converge on this type of program and the idea to create it.
I really appreciate that you brought up all these intersecting issues and just how that has played out in Denver in terms of motivating people to be in favor of non-police first responder programs. In St. Louis, I can just say that we also identify with some of the struggles that you talked about. Making sure that unhoused people have what they need is really a major struggle every single winter, every single summer. We also have those temperature fluctuations getting worse with climate change. And you also mentioned, murder of someone who is, every person is an important part of our community. And the fact that you said it was in 2014.
15.
15. Okay, so very close to the murder of Michael Brown Jr. in 2014, and obviously the powerful Ferguson uprising that basically, sparked so much momentum, even internationally, for human rights. It's a big deal. So I want to talk about how you witness community advocacy for a first responder alternative go from just an idea, then to organizing community support, to a fully funded pilot program, and now you're in the expansion phase. It's interesting that you bring up that it is a money-saving program essentially for the city. I think that's something that people aren't always aware of. And I think the fact that, pilots do take money, close to $2 million, I believe. And so that can be hard for people to wrap their minds around, that you have this initial investment, but there's kind of longer term cost saving results that can actually happen quite quickly. So there's a bit of nuance with that. Can you walk us through the timeline of events from the idea of a first responder program, first responder alternative program, to where you are now, where you're looking to expand it?
Yeah, well, when I learned about Cahoots and when we wanted to do an event to kind of like have this as a feature for the public, the community education aspect of it, we did an event in 2017, and this directly followed the murders of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling in 2016. And it just, like, this summer particularly was just so ideal for an event like this. And we called it, it doesn't have to be like this. And it was explicitly an event oriented towards looking at alternatives to policing in jail. How can we imagine that kind of world? And so Cahoots was a part of that event, and that just talking with somebody live from Cahoots or from Eugene about that program was something that really stuck out to the whole community that was present at that event. And that's, like I said, when I knew that I really wanted to kind of make that program a reality. And so in 2018, we started building a coalition around this idea. And like I said, people came from a lot of different places, advocacy, but we really wanted to partner the Street Medic collective that we were working with, to kind of have that element of it. And we wanted to build it in the community first. And that was a really important thing for us, because that really mirrored how Cahoots started. And it really was important to us because we know how these things can get derailed or distorted when they, when the city leads the effort. And so we, in trying to create the program, we brought together folks who were domestic violence counselors, sexual violence educators and advocates, and folks that work with and serve or are unhoused folks, as well as people that have family members or have themselves experienced mental health crisis. And we really tried to build kind of what this could look like. And one of the biggest barriers for us was the funding, obviously, and the communication network to be able to send folks out. At the same time, the Denver police chief had been presented this idea by one of the folks that we were working with, one of the organizations that we were working with, and where we actually wanted to house this program, which is called Servicios de la Raza. And so when the chief, of police learned about this program, he was very supportive of it. He was actually commander when he first learned about it. And so at the same time, there was a community effort to create the program. The police were kind of exploring this idea as well. And in 2019, a delegation of the community and the city kind of administrative folks, including the police, went to Eugene, Oregon to learn about this program. And from there, we came back and established a work group that was explicitly there to create what eventually would be called the STAR program. And that was again in 2019. But the prospect for us was that either we could create it in the community, have our own program, the police would have their program, and there would be two, but obviously we would not have the resources, we would not have access to 911. And so in a good faith effort, we stayed at that table and said, we'll make something happen collaboratively. And we did, and we stayed at that table. And like I said, it resulted in the launch of the STAR program. But that has kind of undergirded a lot of issues that continue to kind of persist within the program about that vision of really being a community program. But it really just came together from people daring to be creative and envision something for our communities that a lot of people said would never happen. But we went to every single council member. We talked about this in the community to other nonprofits, to other folks that were just working in the advocacy realm, we just did so much public education about this idea, which really gained a lot of popular support for it. And then, we also worked very closely with media to make sure that they knew that this was happening, so that if the city decided, actually, no, we don't want to do that, that there was a public record of them saying, we're going to do this program. So I think we did an effective job of really communicating to the public, communicating through media, and really just educating as many folks as we could that this is an idea that can prevail in Denver.
Yeah, that's really powerful to have you describe the role of grassroots organizing in that, and also just making sure to have all the different stakeholders at the table. So people who are advocating for different people, and also folks who are working within the system that we've got. It is really tricky. We're talking about a non-police first responder program, and you're also talking about needing to involve the police department because that is the system that we're living in. It's really tricky. Ford through Ferguson is one of the founding members of the Defund, Reimagine, Transform Coalition here in St. Louis. And we have a strong stance saying that we, as a region, and a lot of cities do this, overinvest in policing and the arrest and incarcerate model, which to us does not, and from what we're hearing from community, does not adequately address the needs of our community. And that we think that investing in things like health and human services and supports for people to access what they need in terms of education, housing, etc., that's really where we should be putting our resources. So I want to know how did the non-police first responder program, once it was implemented, start impacting Denver community members? Like, what did you hear from them? What was the response when it started being implemented? In St. Louis with Ford through Ferguson, we're talking about transforming 911. And you mentioned the importance of tying it to the 911 system.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a layered conversation because, like you said, as we know that 911 is so important for people that they use that automatically as kind of the default, we also believe in getting away from that as well. So we are very much invested in, kind of alternatives, and we'll be launching our own kind of dispatch tool for the community soon. But to your question about, how STAR was received once it was created, that thing you mentioned about that tension between being a program that was launched in the police department initially and that not being what our community wanted, we had the immediate demand from community to transfer the facilitation of the program to a community facilitator. And that ended up being DASHR. So right after the STAR program launched as a pilot, which was June 1st of 2020, we took over as the community facilitator by the end of the summer. And so DASHR was leading the kind of meetings, the conversation, the expansion conversations, the data and evaluation for the pilot program, which was, again, June 1st to February in 2021. And, that was an immediate kind of thing that the community wanted, is that we can't have this conversation led by police, and it can't be a program that lived in the police department. And so eventually we were also able to transfer the program out of the police department into the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment. So that was a community kind of demand that this is not a police program, this is a public health program, which is where we eventually got it transferred in 2021. But in terms of like how people in the general public receive the program, it has such a wide appeal. So many people are so in favor of the idea because it just makes a lot of sense. You don't want people who are in crisis constantly experiencing the risk that they're going to be arrested, ticketed, or jailed because they're in crisis. That's not how we deal with public health issues. That's not how we deal with people in crisis. And so for the public, it's such a common sense idea that, yeah, it makes a lot more sense to have the appropriate responders dealing with mental health issues or dealing with overdose and substance use issues or connecting people who are living on the street with services rather than giving them tickets. And that was an immediate point of support from the broader community. And then our organization did a lot of outreach to make sure people knew about the program. And so every Sunday we went out, we not only handed out snacks and water to our folks living on the street, and not only did we have our street medics out there just trying to take care of people and address immediate first aid issues, but we also had people go to businesses and talk about the STAR program and say, instead of calling the police, instead of calling 911, here's a resource for you, because STAR does have a direct number, even though it is still, lives within the 911 dispatch center. So here's another option, and it's one that will actually resolve a situation rather than just ticket somebody or go away. And so, we've had overwhelming support from businesses as we talk about this. Over 300 businesses we've talked about this program to, and they've, at least my experience has been, it's been overwhelmingly favorable. People have used the program as a result of our outreach, And the thing is that for a business, it's also not a great thing to constantly have police cars in front of your business if you're trying to address a crisis. And so it appeals to folks who are trying to keep a business, trying to appeal to the public as well, to have somebody who's more trained and more appropriate to respond to these things, and to not have a police car constantly in front of your shop or whatever. And so it's been very favorable to business leaders or folks that work in Denver, as well as people that live in Denver, as a very common sense idea.
That's so powerful to hear about that response from businesses. I think sometimes folks who are really interested in social issues are pitted against business, and or like the narrative is that those two things cannot go together. But what we know is like everyday people own businesses, everyday people are employed by businesses, and we all use businesses, and it'd be great if we could kind of strengthen our ties in terms of supporting local small businesses. And to your point, they're often the people who have to respond immediately to crisis situations happening right in front of their door on a day-to-day basis. So it's really encouraging to hear that they were able to use this alternative, call a number and get the situation resolved, know that a person could get the resources that they need versus just being, ticketed, thrown into kind of the arrest and incarcerate system that we have, put into jail and that sort of thing, and just come right back out once they're out. So, what's interesting is you're talking about all this really hard work of organizing people, having so many conversations, educating the public about these alternatives, and at the same time, you've become a resource for people across the country who are trying to start first responder alternative programs in their cities. What interest have you heard or seen in non-police first responder programs across the country?
Yeah, so even before STAR launched, we were immediately working with other cities. In Colorado, for example, DASHR was working with community members in Fort Collins, which is north of Denver, to think about a similar type program. We had also started working in Aurora to try to create a similar program, where Aurora was put on the map because of the murder of Elijah McClain, which was 2019, but his name really came to public awareness during the 2020 protests. So we were working with Aurora as of January 2020 to try to create a similar program. And we actually did create a program in Aurora that launched. It was actually approved in September 2020, launched September 2021. So we're past the year mark in that pilot program as well. But that program is called Aurora Mobile Response Team. We worked with council members and the city manager to create that program. And in Aurora, with a city that is so divided, I mean, you could argue that in Colorado, it is one of the most sharpest divided city councils in our state, between conservatives and liberals, but also specifically on the issue of policing. And yet, when we put that proposal forward, it was voted on unanimously by their entire city council and approved, to have a pilot to replace law enforcement for low-level 911 calls similar to STAR. So we've already created another program in addition to Denver's. And DASHR, once STAR launched, we had a lot of folks in Colorado reaching out to us. And so if the city reached out, we had a conversation, but if community members reached out, we said, we'll work with you to create something similar if you're interested. And that demand has led to us working with about 14 total cities in Colorado to create programs like STAR. So anywhere from Arvada, which is launching their program soon, to Lakewood, which is a little bit outside of Denver as well, Douglas County, which is south of Denver, Aurora, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, Fort Collins, Boulder. Like I said, it's about 14 total communities that we're working with in Colorado to create programs like STAR, with 2 successful launches in Denver and Aurora so far. Outside of that, we've had a ton of folks reaching out from around the country. Again, if it's community members that have reached out to us, we've had a very honest and really great conversation about how to advocate for this type of program, how to make it a reality. If it's city leaders that reach out, we're happy to talk to folks. We've talked to dozens of folks across the country, or dozens of cities rather, across the country, about STAR and about programs like it. At the same time, we also say, make sure you're talking to people in your community, because I'm sure you all know, there are community members advocating for these things when elected officials reach out in their own areas. And so the first thing we say is who are you talking to locally? Because I'm sure there are people in your community that are already advocating for this, that might even be working towards it. So, we're happy to have these conversations. Like I said, we've had dozens of them with dozens of cities across the country. And we know that there have been successful launches as a result of some of those conversations. But again, we know that communities already demanding this idea. Communities already working towards these ideas, and so we know that a lot of folks already have some of the answers in some of city or our elected leaders are looking for.
Yeah, I really appreciate you always putting the focus on community members who are already doing the work, who know best what they need. We've seen that as well. That's why it's been so important for us to hear from people and gather people together so that they can have these conversations. And in the two community events that we've had leading up to it, it's really clear that community members are hungry to take action. So if you could give some advice to St. Louisans who want to start advocating for non-police first responder programs, what would you say to them in St.
Well,
Louis?
yeah. Well, one thing I would say is, sorry, like you mentioned earlier, making sure everyone's at the table in terms of people that are serving the community. Sorry, I could restart that. I don't know if you want to edit it out, but
No,
what I
it's
would,
good. Everyone needs to hydrate.
yeah, it's very dry air in Colorado. We have issues. Yeah, so like the first thing I would say to folks who are, in other communities, St. Louis included, looking to advocate and create non-police alternatives, is to bring everyone to the table. Those who are advocating for, reforms within the criminal justice system. This is something to look at transformation, which is what our organization focuses on. We're not so invested in reforms, and we know that that is something that really nourishes people that are looking for answers to all these headlines that we see every day of people getting hurt or harmed by our system of policing and jail. And so, I would say bring all those advocates to the table, bring victims of violence to the table, because that's really critical. Bring the folks that are social workers, especially those that are actually on the ground, not necessarily the administrative leaders of nonprofits, because that has served as a barrier for us in the past. But bring folks together, bring communities together, start talking to your neighbors and ask those questions. Are our needs being addressed by our current system? If you call 911 and police show up, is that an answer for the thing that you're looking for in your community as a result as an answer to a crisis or a concern in your community? And generally it's not. That's the overwhelming answer that we've received. And so talk with your neighbors, because that connection within your communities is so important to having the success of an alternative, to be able to use something else, but also to understand what your needs are in the community of everyone around you. And then, really start to identify what this program could address in your city, whether it's homelessness, whether it's substance use, whether it's mental health crisis. We all know that those three areas are being hugely impacted by the pandemic, the continuing pandemic, where we know that we have one of the greatest eviction crises that we may have ever seen in our country coming up and continuing, actually. We know that we are facing the worst overdose crisis in our country's history, with fentanyl especially. And we know that mental health is being greatly exacerbated by the loneliness, the isolation, and the health impacts of the COVID pandemic. And so really identifying what those needs are and saying this is actually a really good solution for a lot of the things that come up, because that has been the thing that Denver has experienced. That whether it's people that are just looking to get out of the street or get off the street, or people that are experiencing high level crises that need help, this has been an answer for them. And so bring all those folks to the table, and then when it comes to people in positions of power, make sure they hear you and make sure that they don't get to shut you up, because we have made an intentional effort in Denver to make sure that we are always not just at the table, but that we are knocking down doors. We are pushing down doors to make sure people are listening to us and creating our own spaces to say, if you won't help us create this, then we'll create it on our own. So I would kind of give that disclaimer to any community to say the city or local leadership in elected position or administrative position may not listen to you. So be prepared to create something on your own as well. And many of us have those tools in the community to do that. And that's kind of where Denver is right now as well.
That's really powerful. You started to touch on this already, but basically with this community event that we will be sharing this conversation at, we are going to start navigating what it looks like to implement non-police first responder programs in St. Louis. And we're going to be asking questions of each other about what it would look like to implement that in St. Louis, what would work, how should we, set things up so that it would work in St. Louis. Are there any particular questions that you felt like have been helpful to ask ourselves at this stage in the process?
Well, one is, who is serving the community right now in a behavioral health capacity? Is it a large organization or nonprofit? Are there local or smaller community organizations that could be a house for this type of program? Because that is one of the biggest things that we've seen across the country, is that behavioral health as an area is so dominated by few agencies, that many of which are not serving our communities in the right way. And that is something that has been overwhelmingly revealed in Colorado, where we had something like 12 of our largest behavioral health organizations in the state investigated and found a lot of wrongdoing and harm and underservice to our communities. So are there local smaller organizations that are culturally responsive, that represent the community, that could be houses for this type of program or house for this program? And then, what type of responder do you need? I mean, the STAR program is one example of a community responder program, but there could be other examples of the type of responder that you have on the van or the type of experience that you have on the response. What type of calls, would you want to designate to this type of response? And I think that while there are a lot of problems with the 911, having people that are experienced in that type of dispatch can help you create kind of that decision tree of like what things we are going to divert towards this program rather than policing, because that has been a really critical thing in Denver is like, what is that decision point of we're going to send STAR versus police versus co-responder? And so that's another really important question is, what does that decision tree look like? Who's making that decision? Is it 911? Is it, a combination of things? And yeah, how do we reach the community to make sure they know this exists in the way that they know 911 as a resource is another thing to ask or a question to kind of address within your organizing efforts is how can we really get the community, the public involved in not just awareness, but also accountability of such a program.
Speaking of accountability, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but it is really challenging to balance support for a much needed first responder alternative program while also holding public officials accountable to ensuring that it does maintain or it remains a non-police option that actually represents the needs of the community. What are some things that keep you motivated as you continue pushing and pursuing this hard work?
Well, one of the things is that there are so many people that have said that what we created with STAR was never going to be possible, and that was as recent as 2020 that people said that this couldn't happen, this wouldn't happen, and we created it. And so knowing that there are so many things that our community can envision and that we can create, that we are severely limited by the lack of creativity and imagination of people in positions of power. But knowing that that creativity, that imagination, those brilliant designs exist in our community, and we just need to bring it to light, and we need to bring it together with other folks. So really, that inspires me to know. And I've been hugely inspired by a lot of different things, but one of them is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, and just that thought that like with all these folks that are in positions of power that are kind of holding spaces that have platforms, there are literally thousands, if not millions, of people that are unreached by those individuals, and that we can reach them as community members and as organizers or as activists or as even social workers. Like we can reach the people that are not reached by those in positions of power to organize and to bring to the table and to insist on their involvement and their voice. So that has been really inspiring for me to know that there's a much bigger world out there than the city council meetings and the task force meetings and the advisory committee meetings, that all of those folks deserve and could and can and will be at that table. We have a say in it. And so that has inspired us to move forward and to know that this is our vision. This was our vision that now not only has success in Denver, but has influenced so many other cities, as you mentioned, that has made national and local news on a regular basis at this point. And so to know that we created something so powerful, that it was our vision and that we are responsible for maintaining that vision, and that our vision and our work is held accountable to those movements that I mentioned earlier. Our city officials are, nonprofit leaders that are in charge of these large agencies. They're not accountable to those movements, but we are. And so we have a role in maintaining the fidelity to our values and our vision for this type of idea. And so, we've kind of maintained throughout this whole time that STAR was the compromise. It was not the vision. And we want to make sure that we let city leaders know that that was the case, and that we are fully intent on making sure our vision comes to full fruition and keeping all options on the table in doing so. And so that has really motivated us as well to stay at the table and to fight with everything we have for the vision that we really wanted going into this process.
That's really beautiful. And it's such a testament to the imagination and creativity in Denver to say that STAR is, a good option, and it's not the entire vision, to not limit what visions there could be for a better world, for a better society. I love that. It's so powerful. Something that you said that really stuck with me was about the role of design in all of this. At Ford through Ferguson, we are an anti-racist systems change organization. It's kind of a mouthful, and sometimes hard for people to grasp. But what that really means is that, you know, we're gonna look beyond like individual incidents or like interpersonal things and look at the patterns and you know, what are the systems, what are the structures, what are the policy decisions, the budgeting decisions that make up how society is right now in our region, or what dictates what options are available for people. We too love Adrienne Marie Brown, who spoke at our most recent Racial Equity Summit, and in our opening letter for Transforming 911 on transforming911.org, we have quoted her. She says, "We are in what my teacher friend Terry Marshall calls an imagination battle. The moment we begin to question oppressive historical imagination, supremacy imagination, the moment we begin to dream of justice and of liberation and of right relationship, we become imagination warriors, organizers. Our mission is to then co-dream visions more compelling than oppression and more honest than supremacy, and then move from imagination all the way to new practice." So I thank you for doing that, for modeling that, for working towards that. Are there any questions that I didn't ask that you wish I'd asked, or any parting wisdom that you'd like to leave?
Well, I think like one thing is to know that STAR is just a very small part of our work. We have a whole visual and a whole concept of the way that we approach work, which includes crisis response, STAR, AMRT being part of that work, but also to know that we view crisis and we view safety in our communities as a cycle, not as a point A to point B. And so, we kind of make the distinction between upstream and downstream, where public safety for us means upstream is education, it's employment, it's community resources and infrastructure, it's basic human needs like food security, housing security, access to healthcare. On the back end, downstream, we have crisis response and restorative practices. So, STAR is something that we've created. AMRT is something we created for crisis response. But in that restorative bucket, we've created a program called Restorative Denver that allows the DA, the district attorney in Denver, to divert cases away from their office into a restorative process in the community. And if completed, those charges are dropped completely. And so, it's a full scope of work for us that really illustrates, what I think all communities could be benefited by considering when going into this work of like all those different points of intercepting that violent system of policing and jail where they interact with our community and they don't need to. And so I do want to make kind of that distinction about our work, because it's a much bigger picture than STAR, but STAR is a big part of it, and it's something that we obviously talk about a lot. The other thing that I would mention is, STAR, like I said, it was the compromise, not the vision. Like you said, it's great. It could be better. It could be closer to what we wanted. We are still dealing with a lot of co-optation in our city. They have shut down the community oversight mechanism that existed because we dared to talk about racism and about those systems change and confronting white supremacy within this program. And so, I've mentioned before that STAR can be this transformative, really effective, beautiful program that, dare I say, might be abolitionist, or it could be the worst elements of our criminal justice system and nonprofit industrial complex of behavioral health safety net all at once. And we're trending towards the latter right now, despite the fact that it is so successful as a program. Stanford did a study that, in areas that STAR is serving, it's reducing crime by 35, or crime is reduced. I don't know if STAR is the mechanism, but in areas that STAR serves, crime is reduced by 35%, and that the response itself is 1/4 the cost of policing when we talk about the per interaction data. And so it is successful, it could be a lot better, and that's what we're really focused on right now.
I so appreciate you adding that nuance, and it is really moving to hear you talk about upstream, factors and what's happening downstream, because that's exactly the language that we used in our previous kind of community accountability and advocacy tool called Still Unequal. That was looking at educational equity. And we talked about the difference between looking downstream and seeing, how are students performing on tests? Are they achieving their goals? Are they able to go to college and things like that? And the difference between that and upstream factors like, school funding and, where neighborhoods are situated and how that relates to that school funding, and then how that impacts things like, do students have the textbooks that they need? Are they able to access calculus or art and music? So similar to you all, we do have a broad vision also of wellness, and so it's really powerful to consider this kind of kinship that we have, even though we're in St. Louis and you're in Denver, that we're all working towards this broader vision. We're anchored by the 189 calls to action created by the Ferguson Commission. There's so much work to do, and yet, to your point, it's worth it, and it's possible if we believe and we work together in community to work towards that bigger vision, and keep pushing towards a world where everyone can live and thrive. So I thank you for taking the time with us to share what you've learned, and to help us take a peek into that vision and where you are in that point in that vision, and to know that we're working together and we can be hand in hand to push forward even more. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and always open to further collaboration, whatever that might look like. So we'd love to connect later.
Wonderful. Take care.
You too.